In this video, I'm going to answer questions that I've gotten on my channel in the comments section. So if you have a question, make sure you leave it in the comments section and I'll try to make a video on it. Comment or question comes from Lynn Bradley 7387, and she said, can we retire at 66 and 71? I'm assuming that's a spouse or partner at 71. $1,500 a month, and I'm assuming, let's see, that's total Social Security, she tells me, total SS, and $250,000. They've paid for their house, they have no debt, and they don't travel. Okay, so I guess my first question would be, are you not traveling because you don't have the money to travel, or you feel like you can't travel? And if that's the case, then that's kind of a bummer, because now you're in retirement and you have all this time when you could travel. So I always like to say, figure out a way to make some extra income so that you can travel and you can enjoy the life that you want if you haven't saved enough money. 66 is real young still, in my opinion, and 71 is pretty young as well. And so I want to say that first. I am against this whole thing of the day you retire, you no longer have the motivation or the interest in making money. I think it's a great time to make money, because you have more time, you've left your job, you know a whole bunch of stuff, right? By the time we get my age, we've learned a lot of stuff. So there's always something there that you can teach or share with others, or just so many ways you can make money now with the internet, an advantage that we have now that previous generations have not had. And the young people are getting this, right? So having said that, let's look at the math. Okay, so I've got my calculator here. So all I'm going to do is, initially what I'm going to do is say, okay, they've got $1,500 a month and $250,000. So I'm going to put $250,000 into my spreadsheet, and I'm going to say times 0.04%. Now, you can look at my other videos about why I'm using 0.04%, but that's because that is the traditional, most common retirement withdrawal rate, 4%. I've said a lot about that, pros and cons, there's good and bad. I don't think it's the be-all, end-all of retirement planning for a lot of different reasons. You can watch my other videos on that, but that's what everybody uses, most people use rather, and that is the most common method for spending down your retirement account, which is, oh, don't even get me started. Okay, so now I've lost my numbers here. So we're going to put in $250,000 for $250,000, and we're going to say times 0.04, and that gives us the annual amount that will be withdrawn in that first year. That will be increased every year for inflation. That's the only way you can maintain your standard of living, Lynn. So you'll need to increase that every year, assuming there's inflation every year, which is a pretty valid, I think there's only been like 1 or 2 years there wasn't inflation. Don't quote me on that. And so that comes up with $10,000. And if we divide that by 12, I like to equate things to monthly, because that's how we think of our expenses. That's $833. And then we're going to add that to the $1,500, and most of y'all can probably do that in your head. I'm going to use my calculator. That's $2,333. Now, that's kind of a rough idea, especially for year one, but what we would really want to consider beyond that is, what are your earnings on that $250,000? You know, have you got that invested, and do you have earnings on that, and how reliable are those earnings? The reliability of the earnings on your investments, in my opinion, and I don't even know if this is an in my opinion thing, I think it's more like facts, but economic factors, the overall financial markets, macro factors are what determine how much we will earn on our investments, and that's hard to predict. Sometimes they're down and sometimes they're up. Sometimes our investments go up in price, sometimes down in price. For example, the S&P 500 in the whole first 2000s decade had a slightly negative average annualized return. So we can't make an assumption that stocks, if you're invested in stocks like most investors are, will go up every year. We just can't. So I'm looking at just these raw numbers, because this is just simple math. What I would suggest that you do, though, Lynn, is just use a real basic retirement calculator and put in your numbers and put in the return that you think you will make from your investments over however many years you think you'll live. I know these are really, really hard calls, but that's what you got to do if you want to really dig into these numbers a little bit more, and if you've got that money invested, okay? And that's kind of a basis from which you can work. I hope that's helpful. There's just a lot of moving parts to that number, but that's kind of the basic is take your savings you've got, and if you're going to invest it, then times that 4% withdrawal, and kind of the goal is you're making more with your investments than you are withdrawing at that 4%. That's kind of got to be the condition for that really to work. But remember, you've got to increase that amount every year to maintain your current standard of living, because everything costs more every year because of inflation. Okay, I hope that was helpful. Sometimes I feel like maybe I give a little TMI, too much information, but these are important topics I talk about. I don't take them lightly, and I try to give very accurate information, and that means I've got to go down a rabbit hole with you with you all, which leads me to Paul Turner 44:19, then a question. But I thought it was really important that I address it, because what Paul has said is, AS, he's referring to Allocate Smartly. He's referring to my Allocate Smartly review video, and I go into a lot of detail about how I personally invest a good amount of our assets and core portfolios, both retirement and regular accounts, in Allocate Smartly using a portfolio I found in there. So that's an Allocate Smartly review, my video on that if you want to take a look, if that interests you. And he said, I think AS is great, but I think you're a little misleading here in your intro. And he's talking about my video intro. The equity curves are mostly back tested, and it's unlikely the models will perform as well out of sample, in parentheses, in the future. Almost none of those strategies were developed decades ago. Okay, so that was Paul's comment. So I take this very seriously, because I try to be extremely accurate and really conservative in what I say, and always sort of with a word of caution. Perhaps it's from my old accounting days, but Paul, what he said is the models will perform, he doesn't think they'll perform as well out of sample, and he says in the future. And what he's referring to there, and I've talked about this a lot, I don't use financial lingo, it's not what I do. So what he's saying is the time frame is different. So if we look at back testing, or if we look at not even back testing, just performance results from any strategy we're looking at, it did this during that time frame, okay? So that's why I detest 5 or 10 year average return data, performance data, because during that time frame, that's what that portfolio did, okay? But when we're retired and trying to live off that money, it may do something completely different. Just like I've talked about in the 2000s decade, boom, stock investors it was horrible. And for example, in, I believe it was earlier 2023, or was it late 2022, when stocks and bonds both went down. Well, we've always been told that, or I don't like we've always been told, but the conventional wisdom, and most portfolios are based on, almost all portfolios are based on when stocks go down, that bonds will go up, and that will mitigate the risk. That's not always the case. Like we saw in, like I was saying, 2022, late 2022, I think it was when that happened, when that stocks and bonds moved down together. Don't quote me on that. It may have been early 2023. So my point is that the study periods, or the time frames during which this performance data is shown, it's going to be different when we're investing in it. It's going to be different when we're retired, because it's different. There are different economic factors, okay? So the Allocate Smartly portfolios, well, I'll just read my response, and it will, I think, pretty much explain things, but I wanted to explain that question because it's kind of financial lingo-ish. So I said, hi, Paul, your comment led me to double check my introduction in my video. Many of the strategies have beaten a typical stock and bond portfolio over several decades. So that's what I said. I find nothing misleading about that statement. I tend to be very conservative in my content, expect less, and be pleasantly surprised is my sort of mantra. Yep, as I explained, the data is back tested. I make no promises whatsoever, ever, for anything about future performance, and never suggested the strategies were developed decades ago. Thanks for your comment.